In part 4 of our Shelf Unit Inventor project, we're going to look at how to add lights, shadows and reflections to our 3D scene and how to render an image. Render is where the software, in this case Inventor, calculates the position of the lights, position of your objects, the materials, and creates a realistic 2D image. This is very useful because it means you can communicate your design ideas and you can use your image in a DTP package to create a poster or something to promote your design. So if we look at a render which has been created already, you can see that has a light direction, so the light's coming in from the right hand side mainly. You can see the shadow on the tabletop surface, which is highly reflective, and you can see a reflection on it. You can also see the different materials on the shelves. So for example, the acrylic on the top shelf there is transparent or translucent, and you can see the edge coming through there that indicates that. So if we jump into Inventor, I'm going to use the shelf unit assembly file that we created earlier, and this is how it comes in when you open the scene. So the first thing I'm going to do is, at the moment you can see that doesn't give a realistic view of an object, how we would see it through our eyes or through a camera. At the moment these top and bottom surfaces are parallel. So if I go over to the navigation cube here and I click on the little arrow, I'm going to change that to perspective. And what perspective does is that now it gives it perspective like the real world. In other words, this top shelf example, the vanishing point is way off to the right of the screen. So next stage we're going to look at is how to display shadows and reflections. So we go to the view. You need to turn these on for it to show in a render. So first of all, we're going to turn on, look at shadows. So I've got tick boxes here, all shadows just turns them all on. We've got a ground shadow, so that is the contact between the unit and the ground plane. I'd imagine it was on a desk. We've also got object shadows, so that if there's a light over here, that just means that, for example, this shadow may cast a shadow on the lower shelves or lower parts of the objects. So it's casting shadows like a real object would. And the last one is ambient shadows. Ambient shadows are where you've got light bouncing around a room, for example, and it creates shading, particularly in the edges or cracks where different surfaces join. So a good example of that would be in a room where, if you look at between the ceiling and the walls, there tends to be shading along the sort of edge where they join, and that is an example of an ambient shadow or ambient occlusion. So I turn them all on, we're starting to get a more realistic view. I'll also turn the reflections on, and now in our viewport we have perspective and shadows and reflections. So we're starting to get a more realistic view of our unit. So just to point out as well that there is a button up here which flips between perspective and orthographic. So next stage I'm going to do is I'm going to position my unit on the screen so I can, as if I was looking at it for real, one that I'm happy with. And then I'm going to go to environments and I'm going to click on Inventor Studio. Inventor Studio is the part of Inventor which does the rendering. So we click on that, we get a new menu coming up at the top here. So first thing I'm going to do is talk about cameras. So we have a virtual camera in this viewport already. So I'm going to right click on camera and I'm going to create a camera from view. Now what that does is that creates a camera here which saves the position that we're looking at just now and that's saved in our file when we save it. So if I now save this as self-unit assembly render, the next time I open that up, it will be there. But the annoying thing with Inventor is that when you save or open it up, it loses the viewport settings, so we just need to go and turn this back on again. And I've got perspective on there, so we're good to go. So back to environments, back to Inventor Studio. Now if we open up that, plus we've got a camera in there. So next stage, I'll just go ahead and do a render. So we click on render. This is your pixel size of your image. So I would suggest use the 1024 size. You can also add in a manual size. So say you like to do HD, which is 1280 by 720. You can do it that way. In this case, I'm going to use 800 by 600 because it's renders a bit quicker, and also I've got a smaller screen for this capture. So I'm going to set that to camera 1. I'm going to use the current lighting, and we'll talk about lighting scenes, scene styles in a moment. And I want shaded, which is realistic. So if I go ahead and render that, I'm going to get a realistic render of my shelf unit. So I've got direction for shadows, I've got reflection. You can alter all this by moving your lights. You can make the reflection less obvious, and if you had a real tabletop, you can add materials to that to simulate what you want. So if I've got that rendered, I can save that. So I click the little floppy disk button, and I'm going to name that shelf unit render. I'm going to put 01. The reason I'm putting a number on this is so I can save iterations or versions of my renders, and I can compare them, so I can decide which one I like or see the progress I've been making. So save that, and now that has created an image on my screen. So in this case, the object's very small on the screen, but that's more just so you can see it. You can improve our framing on that. So if I want to change this, what I would do is I can, at the moment you can see this red line around that's a camera position, so that's the edge of our picture, and we can change our viewport or our framing to improve that. I'll leave that as it is at the moment. So next thing we look at is lighting styles. So up here we have lighting styles, and in each of these, this shows, if you look at this, you can see the different lights that are in here. There are 4 lights in this one here. You can move these around to reposition them, and you can choose one of these presets that you have already. So you've got other settings here, such as your shadows. That's a sharp shadow, soft shadow. You can change the density, which is how visible they are. So 100% would make them very dark. A smaller number would make them lighter. So if we choose one of them just now, let's go for 4 colors. If you've lost your camera view, what you can do is right click on there, and I can do set view to camera, and that brings it back to the camera position that's been stored. And I'm going to click render image again. So this time, what was that one? It was 4 colors. I'm going to use that one. You can see that updates on the screen, gives you a representation of what it's going to look like. And this time I shall use my output to save that, and I'll call that number 2. So I render this, I shall get a different viewport or a different view of my render. So if I go into my Windows folder, I can now see that I have my first render and my second render. So you can see the shadows are different, the lighting's different, the colors of the lights are different. So you can vary all that to get a render to your liking. So what you can do with this as well is you don't have to stick to having one camera. What we can do is we can reposition our view, move that in a bit, to get another one that you like. Right click on there, create camera from view, that creates a second camera. Let's render that one and change to a different lighting style, and camera 2, change for output so I don't overwrite the one I have already, and go ahead and render that. So now we've got a fairly realistic view of our shelf unit, so we could use that as an illustration visualization to show it. Sometimes what you'd like to do is you might want to add this to something you had already, so you would probably not want this gradient in the background. You'd want to isolate the image, or possibly the shadow as well, so that you can place that on a white sheet or a different coloured background, or choose your background. For example, you could put a photograph in there and place that in a real scene. So what we'll do now is I'll show you what we can do with the scene styles. So open scene styles, and that does various things, but one of the main ones is it controls the background. So if I right click on there, I can copy that scene style, and I'm going to call this one white background, and I'm going to change that to a solid colour, and I'm going to change that to white, and I'll need to save that. Okay, so now if I go back to my render and then I choose the white background option, let's render. Now, did I change the name of that? No. So change that to number 4. And let's render that. And now you've got a white background, so you could isolate that in Photoshop, or put a photograph in the background, for example. So if we go back to our Windows folder, we can compare the two. So we've got our first camera, different lighting. We've got, this is better lighting because the shadow is going away from us. So we have our computer version, and then we could have our version that we add onto something else, or a photograph, for example. So essentially that is the basics of our rendering. You can go in and change the position of the lights, the colour of the lights, you can change the intensity of the shadows and reflection, such like. That is best done by experimentation. There's one more thing that I'm going to show in this tutorial to help you out. Is what happens is in the original tutorial that we were talking about, the shelf unit, I talked about the base unit, for example, this top shelf unit, this area, this component here, this shelf, top shelf component, that it faces up the way in Y. And the reason for that is when we assembled it, it's easy to position that in the right place. Our rebate joint was facing up, and we can assemble that, so we know that this is going to come in sitting on the ZX plane and with Y facing up, so automatically this shadow is going to be in the default position, because that's real world. What happens in Inventor a lot is it's not, because the way it works, it's not always that easy to build it in the right way, the right orientation. or possibly just clicked on the wrong piece, or didn't pay too much attention to it. But so for example, this one here, you can see if I turn it around to Y, this leaflet holder is not facing the way that I would have preferred it to be. So it's kind of looking different. It's looking at -Z the way how we can, if I turn on the shadows, that will see what I mean. So let's turn on the ground shadows, and you can see that that's not underneath the object, that is showing where the ZX plane is. So if we did a render for that, it's not going to look correct because it's not under the object. So a couple of ways that we can fix that is visually in the viewport. What we can do is we can, if we go to an orthographic view, for example the side, we can change that position to make that front. So we click on the triangle and we go set current view to front. And what that does is that resets the viewports. So now it thinks that side view is the right way up. Now we have the shadow where we'd like it on the bottom. Okay, so I'll do that again from a different angle just to show you again. So say for example, I'll have to reset so it's the wrong way. So say if I set it like that, I'm going to set current as front, and now if I hit my home button, it's fully disappeared. So basically if I go to the side again and go set current view as front, now we have our shadow. What you'll also notice, this doesn't, I don't think this matters for the rendering part, but what you'll notice is the shadows flip around the other way as well, or forwards. But anyway, basically that's visually in the viewport. Now the shadow is the correct way. So when we go to render this now, we go to Inventor Studio, render image, let's create a camera, what we'll find out is, I don't think, let's see if this renders it the right way. Let's go for full colors again. Yeah, so it has actually created that the correct way. So the shadow is now below the object. What you can do as well is, there's another way of doing this, where we go to scene styles, choose the one we're on, and then you change that to, in this case it's, what is it, X, Y. You would change that direction, ground plane to X, Y, and then that's going to reorientate your shadow the right way. So we have now created a effective realistic render of our unit or shelf unit.